Welcome back to Hinduism. In this video, we're going to look at the Itihasa or Hindu epics. First, some historical background. The Mahajanapadas were larger kingdoms that replaced the earlier, smaller kingdoms and tribal republics of the Indo-Aryans. The Indo-Aryan kingdoms around this time were mostly in North India, so this is north of the Vindhya Mountains. Some of the major Mahajanapadas in terms of the history of religion include Magadha, Kosala, and Gandhara in the far northwest. So the Rajas or kings of the Mahajanapadas had an impact on the history of religion. They would often give land or wealth or even build temples for different religious sects that they favored. This was done for two main reasons. One, to show their greatness, their wealth, their power, kind of display, but also in the hope of securing blessings or merit. There's a widespread concept in Indian religions, including Hinduism, that donations to priests or renunciates will give you blessings either in this life or in the next life. In the 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid or Persian Empire conquered the northwestern part of India up to the Indus River Valley. The Achaemenids created the largest empire the world had ever seen by conquering other kingdoms such as Babylonia, Assyria, Armenia, Egypt, Sardis or Lydia, and so on. The Achaemenid Empire developed new systems of administration or control. These systems had an influence on some later Indian emperors in terms of how they organized their empires. Also, the Achaemenid Empire created the opportunity for cultural exchange over a wider area of the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, and the northern part of South Asia, in part because governors or representatives from all of the provinces would gather together in the capital. So there was more opportunity for facilitating ideas, including religion and philosophy. In the 4th century BCE, a king of Macedon, a kingdom to the north of Greece, succeeded in conquering most of the Greek city-states and most of the Persian Empire, including the northwestern part of India up to the Indus River Valley. Alexander's empire did not last beyond his death, but it had a big influence on the culture of the Middle East and South Asia. He was a fan of Greek culture, and there were many Greek soldiers who fought in his armies. After his death, his empire was divided up among his generals, and when they created their own kingdoms or successor states, there were many Greek-speaking peoples who traveled to the different parts of the empire. And so this was one of the ways that there was some mutual influence between ancient Greek culture and that of India or South Asia. Some of the Greek-speaking dynasties that had established themselves in northern India, such as the kings of Gandhara, later converted to Buddhism. After the collapse of the empire of Alexander, there was a new dynasty that arose in South Asia or India itself. This was the dynasty of the Mauryas, who founded the largest empire South Asia had ever known. They were in part influenced by the administrative methods and ways of ruling of both the Achaemenids and Alexander the Great. They succeeded in expelling the last remnants of Alexander's successors from India, and they brought most, if not all, of the Indo-Aryan kingdoms together for the first time. So this was the first time that all of the Indo-Aryan kingdoms were united in one kingdom or empire. This shows the empire at its height when they had also conquered much of South India. The Maurya Empire did have an important influence on Indian religion. It was founded by Chandragupta, who ruled from around 321 to 297 BCE. So he united most of the Aryan kingdoms, drove out the remnants of Alexander's empire, And he promoted many different religious sects. It was common for ancient Indian kings to give to different religions. However, he favored Jainism, and that may have been one of the reasons why Jainism persisted beyond the ancient period. Chandragupta's grandson was Ashoka the Great, who's probably the most famous of the Mauryas. He was the one who succeeded in conquering much of South India, which facilitated the spread of Vedic religion or Hinduism to other parts of India. And he also is famous for erecting many pillars with his edicts and pronouncements. He also carved them into rock faces. Some of these were legal policies, others were just wisdom teachings that he was sharing with his subjects. So after his conquest of South India, according to tradition, he had a change of heart and was kind of personally appalled by all the violence and death that he had caused. So he tried to rule in a more non-violent and just fashion. Buddhists regard him as converting to Buddhism. He actually supported many different religions, although he may have been personally faithful to Buddhism more than the others, kind of like his grandfather had promoted Jainism more than the others. Ashoka the Great is famous even among Hindus because he was the first one to unite India politically. He's also looked up to by Buddhists as an ideal king who brought wisdom and justice to his rule. The picture on the right shows one of his edict pillars and what the capitals of some of those pillars looked like. The Itihasa are Hindu epics, which are long poems that recount stories featuring heroes and Hindu gods. They include the Ramayana and Mahabharata. They are similar to the epic poems of other cultures, such as the Iliad and Odyssey of the ancient Greeks. They were composed by multiple authors over many centuries, starting around the 4th century BCE. They were written in Sanskrit because that was a language that could be understood by Brahmins and many other people across much of India. They served as a kind of basis for Hindu culture. Both literate Brahmins and scholars knew them, but also the common people. They were very exciting and entertaining tales. So they're similar to the ancient Greek epics, Iliad and Odyssey in that regard, the stories of which were known to basically all Greeks and many other peoples. And they're still celebrated today. Parts of the Ramayana and Mahabharata are reenacted in Hindu festivals, and they even spread to other countries in ancient times in Southeast Asia. So what is now Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, for example. Even though those countries no longer practice Hinduism for the most part, many of them still know the stories of Ramayana. In terms of their religious significance, they're called history, Itihasa, but they do count as a scripture. And specifically, there are two main types of scriptures in Hinduism, Smriti and Shruti. Smriti means remembered scripture, and those are things that are regarded as having had human authors, but they contain religious truths. They were basically written or composed under divine inspiration. Whereas the other type of text is the Shruti. These have no human author. They were authored by Brahman or God and were revealed to human seers or sages. The Shruti texts include the various parts of the Veda, including the Upanishads. Smriti scriptures include the Itihasa, also the Dharmashastras and Puranas. The Ramayana is a story of Rama, who's an avatar of the god Vishnu. He's the eldest son of King Dasharatha, who's the king of Ayodhya. Ayodhya is the capital of his kingdom. Dasharatha had 3 wives. Rama was the son of his first wife. His second wife was named Kaikeyi, and she was the mother of another son, Bharata. When Dasharatha had first married Kaikeyi, he promised her he would give her any 2 gifts that she might ask for. She didn't call upon him to fulfill his promise until Dasharatha got older and it came time for him to choose a successor who would follow him as king of Ayodhya. He expressed a wish that his eldest son Rama would be his successor. It was at this time that Kaikeyi demanded that he fulfill the two promises that he had previously granted to Kaikeyi. Her first request was that Dasharatha banish Rama, send him into exile. And her second request was that Dasharatha would declare her son Bharata to be the heir, not Rama. So this greatly distressed and grieved Dasharatha because he really knew that Rama was the wiser and better ruler, but he felt bound by his personal honor to fulfill his promise to his second wife. This is a kind of familiar theme or trope in a lot of ancient Indian stories of kings making promises that they later have to fulfill. There was a great amount of weight, morally speaking, placed on fulfilling one's word. So speaking truly and honoring one's promises, contracts, obligations, oaths. This was sort of the foundation for public morality. Satya was, or truth, was a moral virtue going back to the early Veda. So that can help explain why Dasharatha would have felt compelled to fulfill the promise despite the tragedy of it. So Rama fulfills his father's wish. He goes into exile voluntarily. With him is his wife Sita, who's regarded as an embodiment of purity and virtue. Just as Rama, the great hero, is an avatar or incarnation of the god Vishnu, Sita is regarded as an avatar of the goddess Lakshmi, who is traditionally regarded as the wife or consort of Vishnu. Together with Rama goes one of his other younger brothers, Lakshmana. Lakshmana is the son of Dasharatha's third wife, but unlike Kaikeyi and Bharata, Lakshmana is faithful and loyal to Rama. So he's a symbol of kind of like a loyal friend or ally in the story who sticks by your side even when you're down. When they're in exile traveling through the wilderness, they come upon a shape-shifting forest spirit named Hanuman. Hanuman is often depicted as a monkey, as you can see in the painting on the right. Hanuman is just one member of a kind of race or species of forest spirits. However, he becomes the follower of Rama, and he's very devoted and loving and committed to Rama. So he becomes a kind of symbol for how a worshiper should be devoted and committed to God. You can see the Ramayana has lots of characters that fulfill moral virtues and provide moral lessons for the reader or for the listener. When they're in the wilderness, Sita is kidnapped by an evil demon king named Ravana. Ravana has 100 heads, and he's the king of the Isle of Lanka to the south, which corresponds to the modern nation of Sri Lanka. So the Ramayana, like the other epic Mahabharata, has a long, complicated plot, so we can't give a full summary of it here. But basically, Rama has to invade the island of Lanka, fight Ravana, defeat him and his demon army, rescue Sita, and he also has to go back to Ayodhya and establish his rule in place of his younger brother. The rule of Rama is called Ram Raja, and it's regarded as a political ideal in Hinduism, as a symbol of what justice looks like when placed onto a human kingdom or the material realm. The other Itihasa epic is Mahabharata. Mahabharata means great Bharata, and Bharata was an ancient Indian kingdom. It was also the name of the younger brother of Rama. This just reflects the fact that sometimes these heroes or characters in ancient stories are named after ancient kingdoms or vice versa. The plot of Mahabharata is difficult to summarize. It's very long and complicated. With both Ramayana and Mahabharata, they're exceptionally long. We're talking tens of thousands of lines of verse. And so if you printed them out, it would be like a whole bookshelf worth of books, not just one book. You could compare them in that respect to modern multi-volume fantasy epics like Lord of the Rings or George R.R. Martin's Saga of Ice and Fire, or even longer stories of multiple heroes like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's the type of complexity and diversity of cast and characters that they have. So Mahabharata is about a feud between rival cousins of a royal family over essentially who will inherit the kingdom. The good guys are called the Pandavas, which are 5 brothers. Yudhishthira is the eldest and their leader, and his younger brothers are Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva. Their enemies are the Kauravas, 100 brothers. They include Duryodhana, who's their leader, and his second in command, Dushasana, and of course many others, all of whom have names actually. So the Pandavas actually share a wife named Draupadi. And the story of how that happens is Draupadi's father had a contest, an archery contest, for who could have the honor of his daughter's hand in marriage. Arjuna, one of the Pandavas, was the best archer of the entire area. And so he actually won the contest, although with the help of his brothers. When they returned home, their mother confronted them and basically said, "Where have you been? What have you been up to?" And they said, "We've been collecting alms or donations." And she said, "Well, whatever you collected, you have to share amongst the 5 of you." And so she had no idea that what the so-called alms or donation they had actually collected was their wife. And so because of this, Draupadi became not just the wife of Arjuna, but the wife of all 5 of them, because they didn't want to disobey the command of their mother. Another story of the Mahabharata is how Yudhishthira decides to play a game of dice with the Kauravas. And this shows that these heroes are not morally perfect. This is an act of poor judgment. And he keeps on gambling even though he's losing. In some versions of the story or some interpretations of it, the dice are loaded, although apparently that was not part of the original story. But either way, he's kind of addicted to this gambling session. He ends up losing everything, including his stake in the kingdom, his wife Draupadi, and their right to inherit the kingdom. And they have to go into exile. After this dice game, the Kauravas attempt to dishonor Draupadi by ripping off her clothes in front of the Pandavas. However, Vishnu intervenes miraculously and prevents them from doing so. Whenever they rip off one of her robes, more fabric just appears. It's another famous scene from the Mahabharata. And you can see how the god Vishnu appears as incarnations or avatars in these stories. That's one of the central properties of the god Vishnu, who started to rise in importance in Hinduism in this time. He became regarded as Brahman, or the supreme god, by many Hindus. The picture on the right is of the field of battle before the great war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. The climax of Mahabharata is when the 2 sides meet with their respective armies on the field of Kurukshetra. That's basically surrounding the city of the Kurus. And you can see in the middle of the picture Arjuna with Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, as his charioteer in a chariot. This is actually the scene at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. After this battle, the Pandavas are victorious. They kill all the Kauravas, and they become the rulers of Bharata. And there's also a kind of denouement of the story, where after ruling for many years, Yudhishthira and his brothers give up the throne and seek moksha, or spiritual liberation. So they go on a spiritual quest at the end. Yudhishthira is the only one who gets to the top of the metaphorical spiritual mountain and basically becomes one with Brahman. But there's definitely a lot of religious themes echoing throughout Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita is one part of the Mahabharata, so you can think of it as one chapter of a much longer story. It's also regarded as an Upanishad or Vedanta, part of the end of the Veda, so a revealed text or Shruti, unlike the rest of Mahabharata. That's because it's a dialogue between the Pandava hero Arjuna and Krishna, who's an avatar of the god Vishnu. So most of this is wisdom from the mouth of the god Vishnu. That's why it's divinely revealed. So at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, the 2 armies are opposed on the battle of Kurukshetra, the Pandavas versus the Kauravas. Arjuna is one of the Pandavas. He's a great archer, a great warrior. However, at the beginning of the battle, he says to Krishna that he doesn't want to fight. And there's 2 main reasons. First, the war is between 2 sets of cousins, so he's going to be going against his own kindred. But more profoundly, more importantly, he has heard the teaching that any killing, any violence is a sin or bad karma. This is one of the main themes of the Upanishads, for example, because they teach that killing any sentient being, any being with karma who's part of the cycle of reincarnation or samsara, will result in a bad outcome, either in this life, or you could be reborn, for example, in a hell realm or in some other bad reincarnation. And so Arjuna thinks it's wrong for him to do this, inconsistent with morality, much less attaining spiritual liberation. However, Krishna's answer is perhaps surprising. He says Arjuna should fight in this battle. It's actually his duty as a kshatriya, or noble warrior, to fight in a just war. And moreover, he can do this while still following the path to moksha, or spiritual liberation. So Krishna gives a new spiritual teaching in the Bhagavad Gita, that the duty of a kshatriya to fight in a just war, or to protect their kingdom, can actually be a path to spiritual liberation itself. However, it has to be performed with the right inner attitude or intention. You have to fight without attachment to result. So you're not fighting on behalf of your small self or ego. You're fighting as a kind of sacrifice of your ego for the sake of the greater good, and ultimately for the sake of God or the divine. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna teaches many different yogas or spiritual disciplines, all of which can serve as paths to moksha. So this becomes a very important Hindu text. It's one of the important Hindu scriptures, along with the Veda and the Upanishads, for example. You can look at the Bhagavad Gita as offering a masterful synthesis of many different strands or aspects of Hinduism. And in this context, we're using the word Hindu to refer to religion that acknowledges the Veda. So the term Hindu is somewhat anachronistic here. It wasn't used in ancient times, but it's a reference to Vedic religion that acknowledges the authority of the Veda. The first and oldest strand of Vedic religion is the rituals described in the Veda itself. So things like making offerings to the fire altar that go to the gods. The purpose of these was mainly for the sake of success and prosperity and blessings in this life and a good afterlife. The Upanishads offered different teachings. Even though they acknowledge the Veda, they say the main goal is not success in this life or a good rebirth. The main goal is moksha, spiritual liberation, which you can only achieve if you purify your karma or actions. And the best way to do this is to become a renunciate or ascetic, someone who gives up all worldly attachments, lives in the wilderness, spends their life meditating, gives up wealth, family, career, things like that. And that's how you can attain freedom from samsara, or the cycle of rebirth. There was also an ancient school of Hindu philosophy known as Sankhya that gave elaborate teachings on the separation of the soul, or pure consciousness, and matter. That's everything else, including various objects of consciousness. And then there were the Varna teachings from the Veda, and especially the later texts known as the Dharma Shastras. So these specified the detailed duties of people based on their Varna or caste and on their sex. So the Bhagavad Gita tries to bring all of these together into one coherent vision. As well, it gives a new type of Hindu teaching called bhakti. The Bhagavad Gita is a very early example of bhakti, or devotional Hinduism, that would be developed more centuries later in the first millennium CE. So the key way in which Krishna brings all of these strands of Hinduism together is by teaching the doctrine of many paths, or margas, to moksha. So the view of the margas, or paths, was actually codified after the Bhagavad Gita, where it's called Trimarga, or three paths. This was spelled out in a later text, but you can see the basic idea of it already in the Bhagavad Gita. So if you perform these different paths correctly, all of them can take you to the same result, which is moksha, or spiritual liberation. The picture on the right is known as Vishvarupa, and this is where the god Vishnu manifests as hundreds or thousands, really a countless and infinite number of different beings, each with their own face and attributes. This is a symbol of the multifaceted manifestation of God in the creation, and Krishna actually reveals this aspect of himself to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita to show that he is indeed Brahman, or the supreme being. Krishna teaches many different yogas as paths to moksha in the Bhagavad Gita. The word yoga is cognate or related to the English word yoke, and it has the same basic meaning. To, for example, yoke or harness a team of oxen. It can also mean union because you're bringing things together with the yoke. In a religious context, yoga means a spiritual discipline or a spiritual unification. So in the sense of discipline, it means harnessing or taming your energy of your mind and body and directing it towards a spiritual goal, namely union with God or Brahman. It also has a more specific meaning in a religious or philosophical context. There's a school of Hindu philosophy or Hindu thought called yoga. You can differentiate yoga as a school of thought by placing a capital Y at the beginning when you're writing it in English. One of the key teachings of yoga is focusing on meditation as the preferred means to attaining union with God. We'll talk more about yoga in a later video. It's also sometimes called Sankhya Yoga because it combined the philosophical analysis of consciousness and matter that had been present in the earlier Sankhya school with its own teachings on meditation, etc. Now, in a more modern context, when we hear the word yoga, we tend to think of a modern form of Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga means forceful yoga, and this is an ancient Indian practice. It goes back to the first few centuries BCE, probably. It's a type of spiritual discipline that focuses on breath control. So yoga in general often refers just to meditation, but Hatha Yoga in particular refers to training your breathing either as a means to enlightenment in itself or as a way of facilitating meditation. And modern Hatha Yoga is different still because it focuses even more on the physical postures or asanas you adopt. And this is something that is highly influenced by European gymnastics and calisthenics. A lot of the poses of modern Hatha Yoga actually developed in the 18 and early 1900s, even though it does have its roots in this older, more ancient tradition. So for example, there were yogis in ancient India practicing some of the asanas, just not many or most of the modern ones, and they emphasize more breath control and meditation. So let's talk about yogas in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna names many different yogas, more than 3. We're going to go over the 3 that correspond to the 3 parts of the later teaching of the Trimarga, or 3 paths. These would be Jnana Yoga, or yoga of knowledge, Karma Yoga, or yoga of action, and Bhakti Yoga, or yoga of faith and devotion. So Jnana Yoga, or Jnana Yoga as it would be pronounced nowadays, refers to a discipline of spiritual knowledge of Atman, the Supreme Self, or Brahman, the Supreme Being. You can get this knowledge by studying texts like the Veda, the Upanishads, and Sankhya philosophy. This is believed to give you a kind of intellectual awareness of the nature of the self or consciousness, and you can use that to dissociate yourself from all other things, so you can eliminate your attachments on the false self that way. Karma Yoga is something that is based on action. So one type of action is action of your dharma in accordance with your duty. If you do your dharma but without attachment to the result in a kind of selfless or egoless way, according to Krishna, this can itself be a path to spiritual liberation. Also, Karma Yoga can include sacrificial actions, such as sacrificing things in Vedic rituals. The underlying idea is you're sacrificing your ego for the sake of God. And then finally, there's Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti can be translated as participation, a sense of being in a relationship with, committing yourself to a god or goddess. And in the Bhagavad Gita specifically, Krishna says you should love him, Krishna, as the supreme being. There are other types of Hindus who worship other gods or goddesses as supreme. The idea that Krishna puts forth is that selfless love allows you to attain moksha. So it's a similar kind of thing with the Jnana Yoga and the Karma Yoga, where you transcend your ego or small self or false self and attain union with a larger reality, which is interpreted as God in the Bhagavad Gita. So all of these can lead to moksha, but they're not all equally available. Jnana Yoga, because it relies upon study, is going to be more accessible to Brahmins and other wealthy or high caste people. Karma Yoga is also going to be more available to Brahmins who can perform Vedic rituals, or to Kshatriyas, for example, who can fight and die in these just wars. But Bhakti Yoga is available to everyone, regardless of their caste, sex, or even age, because everyone is capable psychologically of love and devotion to Krishna or God. You can see an example of the Bhakti path on the right, where Radha is a goat herd or gopi. So this is one of the female devotees of Krishna in many stories of his life as the incarnation of Vishnu. They fell in love with him both romantically because he was very attractive, but also their love had this spiritual dimension to it. So the romantic love is being used as a kind of symbol for the intensity of devotion and love you're supposed to have for God in Bhakti Yoga. So what Krishna is doing here is providing many different ways that all Hindus, regardless of their circumstances, can attain this highest goal of moksha. Previously in the Upanishads, it was only presented as available to those who renounced all of their worldly attachments, who left their family, wife and children, or husband and children, became a renunciate in the wilderness, maybe practiced meditation for long periods, relied upon the charitable giving of others, had no worldly possessions. But Krishna here is saying, no, anyone can attain this if you have the right attitude of self-sacrifice.